So we're talking today about governance, and it's one of those topics which I suspect on occasion leads to a kind of glazed look on the listeners. So I wanted to sort of bring to you a perspective on governance that really shows how, first of all, it's important for your organisation and the success of your organisation and the success of your students, but also how it relates to compliance. And I think it's important that we don't get the two too much mixed up, because there is always compliance lurking in the background. And indeed, when we finish up to this morning, I'll be looking at how you can demonstrate compliance in relation to each of these things. But beforehand, I want to talk more about the concept of governance and how governance can contribute to the effectiveness of your organisation. It would have been about 20 years ago that I did my first audit. It was of a TAFE, of a large organisation, and it was of a TAFE. And we rocked up to this TAFE, and it was we were welcomed as a team, an audit team, and ushered up to the third or fourth floor of the building, and we were presented with the boardroom, and on the boardroom table were 12 big white lever arch files of documentation. And because there were 12 in the under the AQTF, I think if I remember correctly, there were 12 standards. And so each big lever arch file related to one standard. And we sat down and we worked our way through that day, through the 12 lever arch files. And at the end of the day, we said, these are fabulous policies and processes and forms and so on. And they said, oh, that's good news. We're really happy about that. And then we said, now tomorrow we're going to go and talk to the lecturers. And they went pale. They said, why would you want to talk to the lecturers? And we said, we want to find out whether or not they know about these policies, whether or not they follow these policies, and whether or not these policies actually work. And the situation there was that they thought that compliance and governance was really about having the documents and having the policies and procedures. Whereas, as Claire has mentioned, we're focusing much more now on outcomes. So it's not so much about do you have the processes and policies and procedures, but do those policies and procedures work? Have they been incorporated into the daily work, if you like, of all of your staff, administrative and training staff? And as a consequence of the implementation of those policies, has that led to an improvement in a quality outcome in terms of training and assessment? So when we look at that today, we would need to understand that we are looking at governance from a number of different perspectives. The first is what the standards have to say about governance. So we're going to start off by looking at the requirements of the 2025 standards. And although they are new, they are nonetheless an extension of requirements that have been in past standards. There wasn't in the past a formal governance area, but governance issues cropped up from time to time through the current standards. So much of it will be familiar to you, but some of it will be new, and we need to stress that part of the newness is that you will need to be able to demonstrate not only that you have processes and policies that service those standards, but also that the impact of those policies and procedures is reflected in outcomes as you work as an RTO. Then we're going to look at the concept of governance, and it's a broader sense of governance than perhaps might reasonably expect, because in the standards it talks about governing persons, and they are persons who can influence the work of the RTO. So it may not be just the governing board or the CEO. There may be others involved in influencing the work of an RTO. So when we talk about governance, we're taking a very broad picture of who are the governing persons who have an impact on the work of the RTO. And we'll look at governance in terms of the way in which policies and activities impact on organisational outcomes. Then look at the benefits of good governance. And it's really important to say this is not just a a job you have to do. It's a job you need to do because it has a big impact on the quality of outcomes of your organisation. And so we'll look at those briefly, and then look at characteristics of good governance. Now, some of these characteristics are written into the standards. Things like transparency. Sorry, almost said transportability. Transparency is written into the standards themselves. But other aspects of good governance are things that are just, it can be identified through the media and through resources. So be a bit of a blend of those components. And then finally, look at demonstrating compliance. And there we'll look at the particular standards, and indeed the standards we're looking at today, the outcome standard 4.1, 4.2 and 4.3. And I need to say that we're not looking at standard 4.4, which is about continuous improvement. That is picked up very well already within a webinar, but also through fact sheets. And so we won't be dealing with 4.4. But the actual outcome standard is overall is effective governance and a commitment to continuous improvement supports the quality and integrity of vet delivery. And we're going to be focusing on effective governance and how it supports the quality and integrity of vet delivery. And the four standards are, firstly, that a registered training organisation operates with integrity. Now, there's a word, integrity. It's going to be something that is important but hard to quantify, and maintains accountability for the delivery of quality services. So that's 4.1. But as Claire mentioned, understand outcome standard 4.1 are a set of performance indicators. And those performance indicators say these are the indicators that we will look for as an indication of that standard. But it is very difficult to quantify something like integrity. So we will see that fit and proper person requirements is a way of trying to strengthen the concept of integrity. It doesn't necessarily mean the person or the governing person or the organisation will act with integrity, but it will establish that there is a basis of integrity. So we have to always keep in mind when we look at these outcome standards that we have to think about what can be operationalised, what can be expressed as an outcome standard through a performance indicator, and that's how we're going to have to work with when it comes to demonstrating compliance later on. The second outcome standard is roles and responsibilities of registered training organisation staff and third parties are clearly defined and understood. When we look at that in a bit more detail, we'll see that that it's fundamentally being able to make sure that each individual understands their reporting responsibilities, who reports to them, who they report to, the decisions and judgments for which they're accountable, and the way in which they fit into the whole organisation, and how that ultimately leads to the governing body or the governing person or the governance of the organisation more generally is responsible for all of the work of all of the organisation through that structure. And then outcome standard 4.3, which looks at risks. And one of the functions of a governing body is to make sure that the risks are either responded to, although of course if it's happened already it's not a risk, it's an issue, because the risk has already happened, but also predict risks and find ways of minimising those risks or diverting away from those risks through their policies and procedures and the way they lead the organisation. So we're going to be focusing on leadership, accountability and risk management. And those effectively are the three areas there. And we won't be dealing with third parties. That's handled separately in other documentation and other webinars. We won't be dealing with students under the age of 18. And we won't be dealing with continuous improvement, which is standard 4.4. I do need to remind you that if you have questions that you need to ask, please use Mentimeter, and those will be organised by Mel. But I also need to say that this workshop itself has been contributed enormously to by Mel, and in terms of providing feedback and advice and assistance in putting this together. I've also been assisted by my colleagues, other auditors, who have reviewed this in its process of development, and so I just want to acknowledge Mel's work and the work of other auditors in putting this together. Okay, let's move into the concept of governance and how it fits within the context of an RTO. And there may be those amongst us today who recognise that the word governance actually is a bigger word than I'm describing here. But we are talking about it within the context of RTOs. And so from our perspective, and in terms of what can be quantified and measured, it's the development, implementation and maintenance of policies, processes and organisational structures to achieve organisational outcomes. And it's about the management of resources to achieve organisational outcomes. So organisational outcomes are the indicator that we have good governance. And we can look at policies and procedures and see how they've been developed and implemented and maintained. But the judgment as to whether or not that's good governance, rather than just busy governance, is that it achieves organisational outcomes. Organisational outcomes will vary from organisation to organisation, so one of the roles of an auditor will be to ask you that question, what are they? And indeed, when you write your sort of self-description for your audit, it's important that you talk about your organisational ambitions, because that way we as auditors and at TAC and the council itself can understand what sort of organisation you are and where you're going. And then judgment of governance can be related to where you see yourself going. So that new component that's been added into the report, where you write your own description of yourself as an RTO, I've forgotten the exact terminology for that, but it's the first part of that self-description that you do, is important because that gives us a frame to understand where you see yourself heading, and then we can look at seeing how your policies, processes and organisational structures contribute to achievement of those goals. So we are basically saying it's not just good enough to have lots of policies and procedures. Indeed, you can usually buy them and just insert your own company name into the purchased policies and procedures. What we need to see is that you've taken those policies and procedures or built these policies and procedures to reflect where you are going as an organisation, what you hope to achieve for your students, how you see yourself fitting into the industry you serve through the training you deliver. What we need to be able to see is how those policies and procedures have been shaped by you and are a reflection of you as an organisation, and how they then function and operate to achieve those organisational outcomes. So that does mean that we move not only into looking at the policies and procedures themselves, but how they're implemented and how they function. And that's why it reinforces that notion of us being outcome focused. And now it is true that an outcome of governance is policies and procedures. So that's part of the story. We're not abandoning those. What we're saying is you need to take the next step and be able to provide us with some sort of narrative. I think Claire talked about a conversation about how they're implemented and how they are effective, and how you monitor them and how you revise and improve them as time goes on. Now, there's a lot of work, and you might reasonably ask, well, why? And there's plenty of documented evidence these days that good governance has very significant impacts on your organisation, be it a large organisation like a TAFE, or be it a smaller and more focused organisation like an RTO that is operating, dare I say it, from a kitchen table, which we find from time to time. So the first is trust and credibility with students, staff, industry and the community. And good governance means that you as an organisation can be trusted and relied upon. That is important, very important in terms of of encouraging people to enrol with you and to pay for your services, and for the community and industry to respect the products of your training programs, your graduates. It can improve equity and inclusiveness of access and opportunity. Now, equity and inclusiveness are parts of the standards, not a part of Standard 4, but they are part of the standards. And under those sort of circumstances, you need to have a governing process and a set of principles of governance that promote the diversity and inclusiveness. And that does increase also your market in terms of potential students. Sustainability, efficiency and improved performance. Sustainability means as an organisation you survive. Efficiency means that you can operate with optimal outcomes, and improved performance are all part of the benefits of good governance. Customer engagement, satisfaction and repeat business. And again, customer engagement of students, both in terms of learning, but in terms of loyalty to your organisation, become important. And that can be reflected in satisfaction and in repeat business. Stakeholder reputation and support. And you are asked to comment on the stakeholders now. And when you think about those stakeholders, you need to think, are we governing our organisation in such a way as will enhance our reputation with these stakeholders? They'll be industry, community, students, and for that matter, your own staff are stakeholders in the success of your organisation. So staff satisfaction and retention comes from good governance. And that also means that you have more continuity, you can have more predictability in the delivery of your services because you know that the staff are going to stay with you. Responsiveness and flexibility. Again, Claire talked about, in particular, being outcome focused means that you can be more responsive and more flexible. And that comes also to a frame of mind of governance. And responsiveness and flexibility in this day and age is really important because the world of work out there in the community is very unpredictable in terms of demands and needs, and there are lots of shifts and changes going on. You need to be an organisation that can realign its pathway quickly, and good governance enables you to do that. And finally, and perhaps the sort of darkest, is protection from scandal, fraud, corruption, mismanagement, reputational damage and even possible litigation. And in some ways, of course, the new standards have been driven by concerns about the quality of training in the RTO, in the vet world through RTOs. And there have been scandals and frauds in other places. There has been examples of corruption and mismanagement. And being well governed means that you can protect yourselves against those kinds of issues. So good governance is not just something nice to do, it's not just something that you need to do for that matter for compliance. It has long-lasting and significant impact on your work as an organisation. When we come to characteristics of good governance, we find and if you Google this, you'll get this. You can look at lots and lots of different lists, and many of them talk about principles or pillars of good governance. And these are the sorts of things which are repeatedly referred to, but there are also things mentioned in the standards themselves. So the standards talk about leadership, and indeed the overarching description of the standard talks about leadership, integrity and compliance, and that's talked about in standard 4.1 when it's talking about the fit and proper person requirements, but also talks about it in terms of compliance. Transparency, fairness and accountability is specifically referred to in a performance indicator. Impartial and evidence-based decision making is talked about. I might add there that I've put in my own word in here, and it didn't get knocked on the head by TAC, so I hope it's all right. Evidence-based. It does talk about impartial decision making, and it's difficult to think about what impartial decision making is unless one thinks in terms of being evidence-based. And that's consistent with both the concept of competency and competency-based training, which is evidence-based, and of auditing, which is evidence-based. So it seems reasonable to pop the words evidence-based in there, which basically means that as a governing body and governing persons need to be not just responding to feelings or emotions, but are responding to evidence, feedback from students, feedback from industry, feedback from the community. That sort of information is evidence, and then you make decisions on the basis of that feedback. We'll come back to that a bit later on. And then finally, risk management, and that is that the organisation's function, one of the primary functions of an organisation is the protection of the students and the staff, but as you'll see later on, also the RTO itself and the world of vet. All of those things need to be protected because all of those things can be risked through poor management. So we're going to take each of those headings as a guide for our next part of this session. But it's a list which is, in a sense, a composite of what one finds in the literature and what one finds in the standards. And it's a reasonable description of what you need to be able to do as a governing body or as governing persons within an organisation. So let's look first at leadership. And please note now that we begin to slip into that territory of what is measurable as distinct as what is desired. So, for example, leadership is often referred to in terms like motivating or inspiring or charismatic. But, you know, we don't have a charismatic meter or an inspirometer. We don't have things to measure those things. So we really can't take that concept of leadership any further. But what we can do is say what can be measured. And the first thing is that people need to be fit and proper. That is, that they need to be able to establish that they haven't in any way run into any kinds of issues with the law, with management history, with financial history, with the provision of information and previous conduct. In other words, people are acting as responsible governing persons in their current work as a part of an RTO, and in their past life, particularly their past professional life. Now, fit and proper person requirements are addressed substantially through TAC's website, so that you can find the fit and proper person declaration form. There's also a fit and proper person webinar. There's or is it a podcast? I can't remember. Is it a webinar? Yes, thank you. As a webinar, and there are guidance documents in relation to fit and proper person requirements so that you can go through that process. But it is important to recognise that those who need to demonstrate fit and proper person requirements has been broadened significantly. So there have been a number of ways in which it's been broadened. Firstly, that the regulatory authority is able to broaden the scope of those things which are needed to be demonstrated for fit and proper person requirements. Secondly, the range of people who need to demonstrate that they've met these requirements has been expanded to include anybody who has an influence on the operations of the RTO. So that's a significant expansion. And finally, an RTO needs to demonstrate that those people continue to meet those requirements. So it's not something just done at the beginning. It is something that an RTO needs to monitor continuously to establish that fit and proper person requirements continue to be met by those governing persons who have an influence on the work of the organisation. So fit and proper person requirements, now these are not really new because they were launched, I think, was it September last year? But they've been in place now for some time as part of that sort of advanced suite of changes. But not only do people need to be fit and proper in terms of meeting these formal requirements, but they also need to be in a position where they can exercise the authority or the influence that requires them to be fit and proper. And that does mean that we need to look at that they have are in positions of authority or positions of agency where they can exercise influence. So they might be board members, they might be the CEO, they might be senior executives within the organisation. Anybody who is in such a position needs to not only meet their requirements, but also needs to be in a position where they can exercise the authority and be accountable for the exercise of that authority. So those sorts of things often end up being expressed through organisational structures and job role descriptions, so that you'll see that there will be a person who leads the organisation, has a number of people reporting to them. How are the roles divided between those two levels of the organisation? How are those reporting accountabilities included in the job descriptions? And working on down the line so that each individual working within the organisational structure understands the components for which they're accountable, understands to whom they need to report, and understands who reports to them. So that could be seen as a kind of chain of command in the organisation. And we need to be able to see that line of authority working through the organisation so that at the end of the day, the governing persons have final responsibility for the work of that organisation. So an organisation needs to have those organisational structures that enable the leadership pathway, if you like, to work its way up through the organisation, culminating in governing persons, and those governing persons need to meet fit and proper person requirements. So an organisation needs first to identify who needs to meet those requirements, ensure that they do meet the requirements, and I might need to stress here that there are occasions when somebody might have some past record that is not going to be helpful. TAC is in a position, and the council is in a position then to make a judgment as to whether or not that relates to the work of the RTO or not. So it may be that in ensuring that an individual meets the requirements, you may have some doubts. That can be accommodated through a conversation with the council. Empower the individual to have sufficient authority to ensure that the RTO complies with the standards and their requirements at all times, and then monitor ongoing compliance with the fit and proper person requirements. So leadership is a much bigger picture than that, but that's what we can assess. So under Standard 4.1, we actually have to look at those components, and they're the sorts of things. So it's fundamentally fit and proper person requirements and organisational structure, but I will come back to that at the end of this session. The next one was integrity and compliance, and integrity is again one of those things that's very hard to actually measure. We're more able to recognise when integrity has been breached than to be able to say that it has been demonstrated, and that's a bit weird. And so fundamentally we have to look at how you make your judgments and how you manage decisions and actions in a way which is both ethical and honest. And so we look at practices and processes that ensure and maintain compliance with the standards for RTOs and other regulatory and legislative requirements. So we might be looking there at compliance reports, and you are required to put in an annual compliance report, and that would help us understand that. We might look at your audit trails, where you have looked at compliance with the standards. We're also looking at professional development, where you might be looking at ways in which you have improved or revised or rethought the way in which you make ethical and honest decisions. We might look at policies and procedures and codes of conduct, and of course internal audits. All these sorts of ways will tell us how you are trying to optimise the ethical and honest nature of the decisions and actions you take. But you'll notice again that we've had to put the blinkers on, because we have to go back to what is measurable, and what is measurable is compliance. And so we end up with focus not so much on integrity as compliance, but the fact that integrity is asked for means that if there are issues that arise where integrity looks like it's been challenged, that gives us a position to be able to say there's an issue here to be addressed. Integrity and compliance is followed by transparency, fairness and accountability. When it comes to looking at the qualities of good governance, transparency is almost always the first one mentioned. And transparency, first of all, means accessible information, so that these policies and procedures that you've developed are publicly available. Again and again, when I look at RTO websites, I am finding more and more often that there is a link to the organisation's policies and procedures. And although students may not spend time reading them, nonetheless is an openness and a transparency which encourages a student to feel comfortable about being part of your organisation, and enables the staff to be able to see and be comfortable about what is required in their organisation and your organisation's principles and processes. So accessible information is going to be very important in terms of making sure that there is an understanding of how you as an organisation work. Now, as soon as you make that information accessible, you've got to think about your policies and procedures and say, are these policies and procedures telling the world what we want them to know? Is this a fair representation of us as an organisation? And so the transparency encourages you to review your policies and procedures and codes of conduct so that they are the sorts of things you want to be known by. And clear communication channels, that people can understand how they can access information, that there are clear forms of, say, updates, regular updates, such as, for example, the Training Accreditation Council provides you with regular updates, and it's a form of communication which enables you to keep understanding and expanding your knowledge of how TAC works. The same thing applies to your governance, that they need to be able to see through regular updates how you are working as an organisation that is governed effectively. And then stakeholder engagement. Stakeholder engagement was something again mentioned by Claire, and it is something again stressed in the new standards perhaps more than was in the past. In the past we had a couple of clauses, and we still only have, I think, only one or two clauses relating to stakeholder engagement, but there is a much stronger emphasis on evidence of how you are engaging with your stakeholders and how you are utilising that engagement as a form of feedback and advancement and review of your organisation. So clear communication channels becomes something really important, and Claire, I think, again mentioned stakeholder engagement as being one of the strengthened areas in the new standards. Fairness is enshrined in part in the complaints and appeals process. The complaints and appeals processes are very little changed from the past, but they are an important avenue for knowing and understanding and getting feedback on the fairness of the decisions you make, be they decisions about enrolment or decisions about assessment, and about, which would be an appeal, of course, or a complaint where there were concerns about the way in which the organisation operated. But equitable treatment, and indeed now the standards talk much more about equitable treatment and the well-being of students, and those sorts of components are now written more strongly into the standards. So fairness becomes an important aspect of good governance. And accountability. And I referred to that before in terms of defined roles and responsibilities, that people know what decisions and judgments and actions for which they're accountable, and they have defined roles and responsibilities that include reporting responsibilities either to the individual or beyond the individual. Regular monitoring and reporting, which basically means that you as an organisation are evaluating what you do and monitoring the outcomes. Again, outcomes like the standards themselves, but other outcomes which relate to your organisational ambitions. and finally governance and oversight, how the organisation is actually monitoring through board meetings and through risk management what is happening within the organisation. All of those components, transparency, fairness and accountability, all contribute to good governance, and what we need to be able to see is how those are operating within your organisation. Then there's impartial and evidence-based decision making. This is the one where I've popped in my own words because it talks in the standards about impartial decision making and informed decision making. Here I've just reiterated a well-worn description of decision-making being a cyclic process. So first of all, there needs to be a recognition of the need for a decision. So good governance will involve a process for identifying issues that need to be addressed, and then alternative strategies for dealing with those issues, and gathering information and analysing information both within the system and from stakeholders so that you can select a course of action. Communicating the decision to relevant stakeholders becomes important, and it links back to that open communication component. Implementing the decision and then reviewing the outcomes. And this is often represented as a kind of wheel because it close back then to reconsidering the choices so that you in fact have a decision-making process. But that is cyclic. But the key thing about this is that it's evidence-based. It's not based on emotion or hunch. It's based on evidence. And good governance needs to be based on evidence, so that there needs to be inputs into governance in terms of feedback and advice and ideas, and so that governance is operating on the basis of actual evidence rather than on whim. Those are written into the standards as part of the clauses. Standard 4.1 and 4.2, I won't go back with the screen, but basically Standard 4.1 says a registered training organisation operates with integrity and maintains accountability for the quality of the delivery of its services. Now that is basically picking up those key words of integrity and accountability. And when you look at the standards, it talks about the appropriateness and authority of persons who oversees the RTO's operations, that there is diligent, informed decision-making and integrity, fairness and transparency in the way in which governance works. So we've dealt with all of those. 4.2 talks about the roles and responsibilities of registered training organisational staff, and third parties are clearly defined and understood. We're not dealing with third parties today, but it does need to be reinforced that in your agreements with third parties, those understandings need to be enshrined in the written agreement with third parties. And here you find words, the concepts in the performance indicators of lines of authority and communication, and compliance with it are well defined, and compliance with the 2025 standards, regulations and legislation is all understood by RTO staff and followed by RTO staff. So anyone who's delivering services on behalf of the RTO is fully aware of their roles and responsibilities within the RTO. So when we can see that all of those things hook back in the standards to good quality governance. The final part, though, of good governance is risk management. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time with this because risk management may be seen in a rather shallow way, but one of the things you'll notice when it talks about risk management in the standards is that it goes beyond just risks to students. And so when it talks about risks to the RTO, so there could be financial risks, and indeed 4.32 talks about financial risks and management, reputational risks, conflict of interest, and that is specifically referred to in the standards, compliance, risk of non-compliance, regulatory compliance, competitive risk, and management, and even risk in terms of the individuals within the organisation, and even litigation. So there are lots of risks to the RTO which you need to either respond to or predict and try to avoid through your management processes. There are risks to students, which could be physical hazards, stress, social issues, self-image, confidence, even the risk of failure and unemployment. Those are all risks that you need to think about when you come to dealing with your students and your policies and procedures. How can you minimise those risks? Risks to staff in terms, again, of physical hazards, stress, social issues, reputational damage, self-image, confidence, workload. Those are risks that staff might experience that you need to consider in building your policies, procedures and your governance style. Risks to VET itself. A bad RTO can do a lot of harm, and indeed every now and then we hear a report, usually from the eastern states, I'm sounding terribly parochial here, of something going wrong, and the problem is rooted back to the RTOs, to not necessarily to an individual RTO, but to the vet sector generally. So we're hearing about issues in, say, childcare, and people say, oh, people are not properly trained, or there are rogue RTOs delivering very abbreviated courses. So that damages vet's reputation. So good governance will strengthen vet, the world in which you work, rather than just being about yourselves. It's also about your whole industry, the vet industry. And then risks to the community. Badly trained people, poorly assessed individuals may ultimately lead to risky situations in the real world of work. So when it comes to managing these risks, we need to think about first responding to present risk. And my son, who's an expert in this area, reminded me that that's not a risk, that's an issue, because if it's a risk and it's already happened, it's no longer a risk. But I stand corrected. But fundamentally, what we need to be able to do is identify the nature and issue that's occurred, assess what the problem was, find a way of, and the significance of the risk, find a way of managing it so that the risk is, or the issue is not repeated, and then communicating the outcomes of that to our stakeholders. And finally, minimising potential risk. So you can identify a risk before it happens. Try to design your processes and policies and procedures and facilities so that the risk is minimised. Implement those design changes or those design ideas, evaluate the effectiveness and continually improve. So to wrap up, let me just remind you in terms of demonstrating compliance against these components. First of all, when it comes to demonstrating compliance with Standard 4.1, which basically requires, which basically says that a registered training organisation operates with integrity and maintains accountability for the delivery of quality services. What we need to see is completed fit and proper persons declarations. We need to see that they are there for all governing persons who are people who have an influence on the operations of the RTO, and that they're maintained. In other words, it's not just a one-shot thing, something that needs to be maintained over time. Secondly, we need to see that you're using evidence-based decision-making processes as governing bodies and as governing persons, that the decisions you make are based on evidence, based on fact, based on feedback, based on information that you've sought and reviewed and interpreted. And then we need to see that there is evidence of staff and student satisfaction. In other words, that they are actually working, that the fit and proper persons and the decision-making strategies are supporting the satisfaction of staff and students who are working or learning in your organisation. When it comes to 4.2, compliance in 4.2, which is roles and responsibilities of registered training organisation staff and third parties, are clearly defined and understood. What we need to see as part of the evidence for that is roles and responsibilities are well defined. So that would normally be some form of organisational structure, along with job descriptions which talk about lines of authority and responsibility and accountability. Staff are routinely informed, so where there are changes in legislation or in the organisational structure or in any of the roles and responsibilities that have been defined above, staff are routinely informed of those changes. And decision-making responsibilities. Who makes the decisions about what and how those decisions are communicated? And finally, when it comes to standard 4.3, risk management, which basically says, 4.3 says, any risks to VET students, staff and the organisation itself are identified and managed. We would want to be able to see your risk management procedures, your processes, your financial planning and management processes, and how you manage conflicts of interest. That again is only partial evidence, because there's a fourth strand to this, which is dealing with risks associated with students under the age of 18. We haven't dealt with that today because that is well documented elsewhere, and I think is going to be part of a further work or information provided by TAC. So we haven't dealt with that today, but these certainly will provide a very substantial evidence base for 4.3a, b and c, but not for 4.3d. So we have a number of references and resources that you can access. Obviously the 2025 standards themselves, the outline guide, the online guidance hub, and there's a fabulous wealth of information on the online guidance hub that you can access. And it's just worth your while hunting around in there a bit, because there's so many good ideas embedded in that hub with which you can work. And then there are a number of fact sheets. So there is one on governance, which is based very much on the same sort of lines as today's session. There's one on continuous improvement, which takes us into 4.4, which we haven't addressed today. There's one on child-safe organisations, which again relates to students under 18, which we're not addressed today. There is a fact sheet on complaints and appeals, which we've touched on under the heading of transparency and fairness. And then there's third-party arrangements, which again we haven't touched on today, but that also reinforces this notion of how governance plays a role in the connections with third parties. I need to thank you for being here this morning and for sharing this time with all of us. I don't know if we have time for questions or whether we have any questions.
Time for one question.
There's time for one question, and the question is, once the FPPF, and that's the fit and proper person, it should be an FPPR requirement or declaration, is completed, does the RTO need to submit them to TAC or simply retain them for evidence if requested at audit? I will stand correct on this, but I would imagine you need to send them to TAC because TAC needs to see those initially, and so TAC will need to know that from your work as a governing body and your governing persons continue to maintain fit and proper person requirements. So the answer would be yes, TAC needs to be provided with that information. No other questions? Well, thank you very much, folks. Very nice to talk with you, and thank you for being here.